halls of government here in the city of Austin. You've been missed.
It is good to be back, Mayor. I'm scheduled to speak on item 10. Is that in order right now?
Yes, it is.
All right, well, to keep it to 1 minute, it has been sold that Austin, Texas has a homicide problem. That is absolutely true. It has been sold that this homicide problem is because we don't have enough officers. That is the furthest thing from the truth. The issue is not that we don't have enough officers. It is that homicide rates have increased by between 30 and 35% in cities all over the United States. If you look at cities with small, medium, or large number of officers per thousand, Austin is in the middle group. It turns out the small, medium, and large cities around the country increased by just about the same amount, between 30 and 35%, all over the country. If you look at Texas, you find that the big cities in Texas increased by 30 to 35%. The rest of Texas increased by 38%. That includes small towns, rural Texas. We had a huge increase in homicide rates that transcended Austin's borders. If we increase the number of police officers, this will divert attention for what we need to do to get that homicide rate down. It will be putting more of our attention, diverting our attention to more of the same. We know from experience that more of the same gets us more of the same. If we want to actually reduce the homicide rate, we need to understand it, and that means we need to know where it came from and what specifically we ought to do something about it. That I think I've extended my
That's
time,
okay.
and my wife thinks so too.
In terms of absolute.
Mayor?
Yeah, hang on a second.
Mayor?
Hang on a second. In terms of absolute numbers, I see you, Ann. You'll be in. I'll call on you in just a second. In terms of absolute numbers,
Yes.
how is the crime or homicides in Austin as compared to other cities?
We are one of the safest cities in the United States, as we have been for as long as I can remember. 80% of cities in the United States have a homicide rate higher than ours. That's after the large increase of 2020 and the first few months of 2021.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilmember Kitchen?
Yes, I just wanted to thank Mr. Spelman. I really appreciate the expertise you bring to this subject. And I would just ask, if you haven't already, if you would email us and send us the information that you just shared with us. It's very helpful.
Council member, I have a 3-minute presentation on PowerPoint, which I will happily send to all of you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Kassar?
Council member, thank you for coming down. So this is the item for us to either adopt this ordinance or to not adopt it.
Correct.
What's your position on that, and
I would
or
vote
advice, and what would you tell us? Why?
decidedly no on item 9. That's the one to adopt the suggested ballot proposition. You have no choice, of course, except to vote yes on item 10. It has to go before the voters since it's been duly signed by enough people. But you don't have to tell your voters to vote for it. I would sincerely urge you to tell the voters to vote against this. It's a bad idea. It's diverting attention to what we really need to be spending our time on, which is identifying what kind of a homicide problem we have and what very specific responses the Austin Police Department and the entire community need to make in order to solve that homicide problem.
Thank you.
Councilmember Tovo?
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Councilmember. Nice to see you back.
It's good to see you too, Council Member.
I had a couple questions for you. As you were wrapping up, you were talking about, we're all very concerned about the rising homicide rate. And you were wrapping up, I believe, with some comments about what might be some good avenues to investigate for prevention of homicide. So if you could give us a couple minutes or follow up.
I have actually written it down and I will send it to you, but here's the short version. If there is a specific reason for the homicide rate going up, and there is, then we can identify what the reason is and work our way backwards to the precursors and do something about it. Let me give you 3 examples. If it turns out that a large number of homicides are due to people getting drunk in bars and then taking it outside, getting into fights and shooting each other, which is true for a lot of places. It may be true for us, may not. If it's due to fighting in and around bars, there's stuff we can do about that. Calgary, Alberta, New South Wales, a whole bunch of Australian places have identified this as being a huge problem in Australia. They know what to do about it. It mostly involves working with the bar owners to change the rules, to threaten them sometimes with having their licenses pulled if they continue to give drinks to people who are already inebriated and aggressive, things like that. So working with bars is a way of dealing with fights in and around bars. If you've got a domestic violence problem, there are a bunch of cities. The Duluth model is the famous case High Point, North Carolina is the most effective case of working with social service agencies, other city agencies, with families directly, with churches, to try and prevent domestic homicides, identify that a homicide is impending or that the level of violence is ratcheting upwards and that there's something we can do to intervene to prevent that from going as far as homicide. In High Point, North Carolina, they took a problem which had produced 17 domestic homicides over a 5-year period, implemented a program involving churches, social service agencies, and families directly, and reduced that from 17 to 1 homicide over the next 5 years. You can't do much better than that. If the problem turns out to be chronic offenders, Boston's Operation Ceasefire gives us a really good model to work with as far as chronic offenders is concerned. Basically, they told all of the people who they thought were responsible for the increase in violence in Boston, we know who you are, we know what you did, and we got a whole bunch of handles on you that we're not using just because we're not using them all. But we can tow your car if we see it, because if it's improperly parked. We have a whole bunch of probation restrictions we can put on you. We have some parole restrictions we can put on you, and so on. And by pulling all the levers we need to in order to get you to change your behavior, we can get you to change your behavior. It turned out it worked. By identifying in advance who the chronic offenders were, telling them what they were about to do, doing it in a measured way, they were able to reduce violence among those chronic offenders and citywide by 68%. So if we got a chronic offenders problem, we can go a Boston route. If we've got a domestic violence problem, we can go a Duluth and High Point route. If it turns out we've got a fighting inside bars problem, we can go in a New South Wales route. There's solutions that have been adopted by police departments all over the country, all over the English-speaking world, that address very specific problems. But we don't know what specific problems we have to deal with yet. That's what we ought to be spending our time on. I should also mention that none of these solutions focus on patrol or response time. That's not a bad thing. It's always good to have more patrols. It's always good to have faster response times. But that's not the core of any of these solutions. And in fact, there's no reason for believing that just having more patrols or just having more fast response to the myriad calls that we have is going to have any effect at all on homicides.
I really appreciate those 3 examples, and I think those are great ones for our Office of Violence Prevention and in coordination with our other city departments, including APD, to take a look at. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Council Member.
Councilmember, thanks for coming back. I recall, this is kind of the area that you work in at the University of Texas, isn't it?
It very much is. Although I no longer work at the University of Texas. I retired in May.
Okay, well, congratulations for that.
Congratulate the University of Texas, too. My students will not have to put up with my calculus class anymore.
Thank you very much.
I believe there are a couple of other questions. If you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Councilmember Alter. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to, first of all, congratulate Councilmember Spelman on his retirement. And I hope that you will be engaged with us as we try to address the problems that you've identified today in your retirement. I did want to just add, follow on to Councilmember Tovo's comments about the Office of Violence Prevention. As I understand it, the studies we have underway right now are precisely to identify the very specific causes of the violence, particularly the gun violence, but the violence in general in our city. This work does not have to only be done by the police department as well. And so I just wanted to underscore that and look forward to working and learning with you on these issues. Thank you.
Council Member, the experience of cities around the country shows you're absolutely right. The best work is done when the police department works closely with other city agencies, other local and state government agencies, occasionally even with the federal agencies, and particularly with the business sector, with the nonprofit sector, with churches. Everybody needs to get involved.
Thank you. Councilmember Kitchen?
Thank you, Councilmember Alter and Tovo and others. That was going to be my next question. Are we working on the analysis that the council member has proposed? It sounds to me, Councilmember Alter, from what you said, that analysis is underway. I would like to understand better, not right this minute, but I would like to understand better the scope of that analysis. And I would like to ask the staff that's working on those analysis to please consult with Councilmember Spelman as they proceed with that analysis. So we can have a conversation at a later time about that. But I really appreciate the fact that, you've provided great leadership, Councilmember Alter, on the Office of Gun Violence, and I appreciate that. So I want to make sure that I understand the scope of what's being pursued, because I'm hearing Councilmember Spelman really appreciate his advice and want to make sure that we both follow it and that we engage him in conversations about it.
I'm happy to work with anybody who's willing and interested in working in this issue. I've been doing this for 40 years and would love to keep doing it.
Great.
Mayor.
Anyone else? Councilmember Poole?
Well, I didn't want to pass up this opportunity to say hello to an old friend.
Hi, Leslie.
And how great it is to see you in chambers, Councilmember Spellman. And also, I think you were my advisor up at the LBJ school many, many, many years ago. So it's good to see you. And I have appreciated your good counsel on law enforcement and police matters in the past. It has been always insightful, not only while I've been on the dais, but before I was on the dais. So thanks very much. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you going forward. Thanks for being here today. Good to see you.
Thank you, Councilmember. I hope my advice was good.
Councilmember Kassar?
So also on this item that you're testifying on, there's multiple provisions. One is 2 officers per 1,000, but another is 35% uncommitted time, sometimes known as community engagement time. And so while the press has oftentimes covered this at 2 officers per 1,000, our city departments, the police department, our budget office have said it's likely closer to 2.1, if not 2.35, given that 35% uncommitted time might be more. Could you sort of talk us through your sense of whether or not it might be more than 2 per 1,000, given the 35%?
Well, first, the proposed law asks the police chief, whoever the police chief is at the time when the law is passed, to identify what they mean by community engagement time. That's a very flexible term. It's not a term of art that has a fixed meaning, and so the police chief has a lot of freedom to identify what is in and what is out of that box. If they are restrictive in their meaning of what is in that and out of that box, if community engagement time is something fairly narrow, that means we might need a lot of police officers to be able to get that community engagement time up as high as 35%. More important, it seems to me, that 35% is not going to be on top of our continuing to do exactly what we've always been doing, exactly the way we've always been doing it. If you have more officers on the street, we know from Parkinson's law, work expands to fill the time available. If you're rushing from call to call already, you got a little bit more flexibility. You'll be doing less rushing, and you may spend a little bit more time on the calls that you're taking now. That's going to reduce the capacity for community engagement time in an unpredictable way. That means it might be beyond 2.2 or 2.3. It might be 3 or even more officers per 1,000 before we can actually get that magical 35% number. The bigger issue, it seems to me, so I think we don't really know, and it's very difficult for us to predict how many officers we're going to need to hit that 35%. I think the bigger issue is, what do we mean by community engagement? If we are just grinning and waving and going to meetings, so showing the flag, that's one thing, and I think that's what a lot of people think they mean by community engagement. That's what a lot of community policing means in practice. What it ought to mean is engaging the community with a very specific purpose. It could be talking to bar owners if we have a bar problem. It could be talking to churches and social service agencies if we have a domestic violence problem, and so on. And the more practical purpose we can put into that community engagement time, the more effective it's going to be. So again, I'm concerned that this proposition is diverting attention from the practical purpose and the practical community engagement with a purpose, and diverting it towards just more mass, more of the same. But we continue doing what we're doing, sooner or later we'll have enough officers to reduce our homicide problem. That's just not true.
Thank you for that. And we'll talk later about a 2.35. Our calculation is that could be $120 million a year, which would be quite a bit. And just as a point of information, as we close out here, I think we do have amendments to increase the budget for our family violence shelter, which is one of the things you brought up, to increase those sort of gun violence intervention programs that we've discussed here and other work here in the budget. So thanks again for your advice.
You do, and I would fully support your proposal to add two academy classes over the next year. We do need the officers back. We should not be held to a standard of 2.0 going forward forever. but we do need more officers.
Great, thank you. Colleagues, any other questions? Councilmember, thank
Thank
you
you
for
very
joining
much,
us
Mayor.
again. Thank you. Is Lydia Woodruff here?